We get everybody's attention? You love birds, Dunn? Thank you. During the dinner, Jane Harding, Justice Harding's wife, asked me if my wife Mary were here. And I told her that, and this is true, she hung a dish towel about a week ago in our kitchen that says, quote, "I just bought my husband a get better soon card. He's not sick, I just think he could be better." So no, she's not here. In the summer of 2017, I received a call from the United States Attorney's Office in Boston from a prosecutor named Eric Rosen, who asked if he could interview my client with the FBI. Not long after that, I received the same request from an attorney in Los Angeles named Don Heller. He represented a man named Rick Singer, who, as you'll hear, was the ringleader of everything that happened. I declined essentially both requests. Both calls related to federal indictments in Boston of several Americans regarding college admissions. Going forward, less than a year ago, I had promised the annual meeting of the Inns of Court in Jacksonville that I knew a speaker in Los Angeles, not Don Heller, someone else, who could be the program for the Inns of Court and talk about this case. And before long, that speaker bailed a week before the program was scheduled to take place. I called Mr. Haller back, and I said, "You may not remember me, and I didn't cooperate with you, but I was wondering if you would consider, if we paid your expenses, coming to Jacksonville, Florida from Los Angeles and speaking about the case and your representation of Mr. Singer." He said he would like to very much. He couldn't. His health wouldn't allow it, and in fact, he died 2.5 months later. But he did say in that conversation, "I'll call you back in 15 minutes. I may be able to help you." He called back in 15 minutes. Everyone had told me he was a great lawyer and a great person, and I think it was a monumental credit just to lawyers generally. And when he called back, he said, "I'm going to give you 2 names, and I'm going to give you their cell phone numbers. They're expecting your call, and I think they can help you." I called. They did. It was the 2 guests we have tonight with the Wall Street Journal. They did it by Zoom. They have done this frequently by Zoom and other means of remote presentations, but tonight is the first time they've ever done it to a live audience in person. So I will tell you, their book, that many of you have seen, received excellent reviews from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, and countless other reviews. They attended and followed all 51 federal criminal cases in the United States District Court in Boston: tennis, sailing, soccer, basketball, water polo, volleyball, and so forth. UCLA, the University of Texas, Southern Cal, Wake Forest, University of San Diego, Stanford University, and Yale University. They lucked into it, and they can explain how they lucked into covering this story, but they did, and as they did it repeatedly for the Wall Street Journal, the publishers started approaching them saying, "We want a book," and that's what they ended up doing. One is Melissa Korn of the Wall Street Journal, Cornell University, Columbia School of Journalism, and the other is Jennifer Levitz, Loyola University of Maryland, and twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It's my privilege to welcome Melissa Korn and Jennifer Levitz.
Oh, wow, that's bright. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Hank, for a lovely intro. I now need to cross out a few lines because you already did it. We will talk this evening about what is known as the Varsity Blues scheme, scandal, fraud, plenty of names for it. You know, it's the one with all those celebrities and the college stuff. So we get that a lot. It's the one with Aunt Becky, right? We will talk a little bit about the scheme itself, how it developed, how it matured, and how it stayed hidden for so long. We will talk about the court case that followed, and how our book dives even deeper into the whole case than our Wall Street Journal coverage ever could. And we do want to save some time for questions at the end. We very much enjoy hearing what people want to know about the case and telling them that information. So if throughout you have questions, we're going to save some time at the end for that. So Jennifer and I will do a little bit of tag teaming here because we both know it all inside and out, and we took on different characters or different people. They're not characters, they're people. We took on different people throughout the case, so we each kind of got in deeper with some folks than others. So you'll see us kind of swap back and forth throughout here.
So the case broke March 12th, 2019. And at the time, I was a national reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I've since moved into an editing role. But I came into work that day, and it was a cold day. And I had just gotten back from a trip to Charlotte, where I was working on another story. And I had my day planned. I was just going to write all day. And I had a big coffee. And then suddenly something comes across we get a press release saying, there's going to be a news conference, 11 a.m. at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts. And just a quick walk away. But I looked over at my colleague, and I said, I think it's your turn to go. So he said, no, it's your turn. So he had the same role as I did. So I run down there to the courthouse, and we didn't know what was going on, but it was clear that it was something important because we had Andrew Lelling, the U.S. Attorney, the head of the FBI, the head of the IRS for New England, several prosecutors. They were all up on the 9th floor, the press room on the stage, and they had huge packets for us, about 200 pages. Andrew Lelling gets up and says, as we speak, we are arresting some 50 parents across the country, from Greenwich to LA to New York, and taking them into custody for what is the largest education fraud case ever prosecuted by the Department of Justice. And he said, these are parents, these are movie stars and financiers, and he described it as a catalog of wealth. And everyone was just sitting there sort of spellbound and trying to take it all in. And then in front of him, there was a poster board of this man that no one recognized, and he was kind of like in a tracksuit, and he had little arrows going out, and as Lelling sat there and he's going to explain the scheme, how this gentleman, this college counselor, had gotten parents into these elite schools by pretending that their children were athletes so that they could, when they were not, and they would pay him anywhere from $75,000 to like $300,000 to get into these elite schools. So everyone was just, we knew immediately this was a big case. And that day, Rick Singer was in the courthouse himself, and he had been working with the government, and he was going to go before the judge and plead. So we went right from that down to the courthouse, down to the courtroom, and Rick Singer himself was there, and he just completely, admitted to everything. And it was a very unusual plea hearing where the judge would say, Mr. Singer, I understand that you did this and you did that, and he would say, yes, I did that and a lot more.
So we'll get to Singer a lot more later. While Jennifer was kind of fighting with our colleague about who had to go down to the courthouse and cover this big thing, I walked into my office in New York and told the reporter who sat next to me, really hope it's quiet today, I'm just not feeling it. And then like 20 minutes later, we get notice, that just as Jennifer had. And a few minutes after that, we get the affidavit, which is 204 delightful pages to read. Seriously, no, I'm not joking. It's a fascinating read. But we got to work, and we started writing stories about who was named in this, what the case was all about, what schools were involved, and very quickly we started breaking news about how the feds even caught wind of this. Okay, it was a tipster. Who was the tipster? We found that out. And over those next few days, I don't really remember eating or sleeping or any of that, but we just kind of kept going and soon realized it was going to be a big story. And I'm going to take a second to explain exactly what this story was. So there were two prongs to this admissions cheating scheme. The first one is about testing, where Rick Singer, the college counselor, would encourage his clients to have their kids tested for learning differences. If they were diagnosed with certain ones, or certain severe ones, they could get extra time to take the SAT or ACT. Enough extra time, they could take it at some designated other site besides their local high school. Rick Singer paid off the test site administrators at a site in Houston and a site in LA to look the other way while his testing savant would go in and either take the test for the teens or fix them afterwards. Oh, just write your answers over here, it'll be messy, so I'll put them in after for you, don't worry about it. Often the kids did not know that this was happening. Some did, and some just kind of sat with him, and but others walked in, took the test, walked out, and then the magic happened. So that boosted someone's chance of getting in, right? You have a perfect SAT score and a B- average. You're still not, a shoo-in in a lot of places, but it was, certainly a leg up. It made somebody potentially stand out a little bit more back then. And that ran, up $25,000 up to about $75,000. Then there was what Rick Singer called the side door. And talk a little bit about the back door later, and the front door, and he had a whole house going. But that was the athletic scheme, where Singer would have his clients' kids, or the teens, pitched as recruited athletes to these kind of low-profile sports. They would be flagged by the coach as a recruit, whether or not they even played the sport, let alone were recruit-worthy. And they would then waltz right in. If you are flagged as a recruit and you meet the very minimum academic standards at a school, you're in. Georgetown even sent letters to these students with their, with their kind of early admission letter saying, you're in, don't screw up, you've got a 96% chance of officially getting in later. So Singer would go to great lengths to make these look kind of real. He had somebody make up regattas, say that somebody played football at a high school that didn't have a football team. And a recruiting spot is a huge deal in college football, let's say. I think you all know that. But when it comes to women's soccer or tennis or sailing, there aren't a zillion websites analyzing every single option. Nobody outside of that sport cares, and even within the sport, at some schools, they really don't care. So the coaches valued their spots, certainly. They wanted to win. They wanted successful teams. They also wanted money, either in their pockets or for their programs, or a little bit of both. And they were willing to use some of their recruiting spots for these kids and put them forth to the admissions committee to be ushered in very gently to the school. Those, the families would pay usually around $250,000. That's on top of tuition later. And some of it would generally go to the school or the coach. Some of it would go to Rick Singer. The kids didn't always know. Again, they weren't part of this. They weren't writing these fake athletic resumes. There were a couple cases where Rick Singer would have their face photoshopped onto an action shot of some other athlete, and that was submitted. It wasn't even good photoshopping. Like, it really wasn't. But it worked. It was enough to get these kids in. So, as Hank said, it touched so many prestigious universities around the country and so many sports as well that it was, you kind of couldn't get away from it wherever in the country you were.
Yeah, so when this case broke, obviously we were covering the news, but we made a decision at the Wall Street Journal to keep going with the story. And I think for a lot of people, there was the whole, it was very salacious. It was movie stars and Beverly Hills, and so there was that piece of it, but that's really not why we stuck with the story. We stuck with the story because, first of all, it included a lot of people in industries that the Wall Street Journal cares about. There were a couple lawyers, there were people in finance, executives, and so that was a big thing. But I think the bigger thing was that it just resonated with people. Everyone had an opinion about it. We had written a lot of stories about the anxiety that people feel about college and around college admissions. And I had just been in Charlotte talking with families who were struggling to figure out the finances at their house. How are they going to pay for college? And then you had people who were trying to do everything right and who had tried to follow the right path and were dealing with disappointment when they couldn't get into the schools they wanted. And I think also just people had this thought that maybe there was a meritocracy in college admissions, that of course we know that people would make large donations to colleges and then their kids would go there, but I think that most people thought there was some sort of meritocracy. And what was so fascinating about this case is that it was just so brazen. The cheating was so stark. And people just wanted to know, how had this gone on? How had the colleges not known it? And why? Why would somebody go to this length? So I think combined, it was sort of the perfect story. You had the money, and then the colleges, who was accountable, and then the legal case itself.
Right, it was money, power, Schadenfreude, it was
status.
Of everything.
Yeah, status.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So throughout 2019 and into early 2020, we're both breaking news for the Journal, writing quick hit daily stories, constantly talking to lawyers and others involved in the case, writing these bigger contextual pieces about these alternate high schools that some students went to and how they just gave easy A's and then it was an easy way to get into colleges, and all these tricks and tips and tools that some of the wealthiest people use to get into these schools, and exposing a lot of them. We were putting this scandal in context of what's happening in certain pockets of America right now. So we were doing all that, and we were gathering string for the book. So it was a lot. We had a few different threads that a few different buckets that we followed. We had the legal case, and we had our PACER alerts set very early on and got absolutely every filing in every case. We needed to talk to the families, understand how this happened, why it happened, what made them think that this was the best path for them to help their kid. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about the victims and also the schools. Those kind of legally were the same, but in reality not so much. And what's changing, right? Are things getting better? I went full conspiracy theorist on this with a whiteboard in the office, and it was one of the big ones. So Jennifer saw the poster board that the feds had put together. I had my little marker, and there weren't any pictures, so it was even messier. We had Singer in the middle, and this parent, and then this parent introduced this parent, and this financial advisor connected this parent to Singer, and all of this. These guys were neighbors, so maybe that's how they got to know Singer. It actually stayed up when we all went home for the pandemic, and we came back to the office, and it would not come off the board. It was just stuck on. So I mentioned the affidavit before, and it was so much material. It was fascinating to read, but that's not enough. That's one side of the story, and the folks in it are kind of caricatures, right? They are very flat. They are people who did bad things at a particular time, allegedly. And I'm sure the defense lawyers in the room can appreciate that, right? What's in the court documents, those initial ones, don't necessarily tell you everything about the defendant. And we knew people are more than just their worst decisions, and their actions needed context. And that's when we decided to kind of inflate these little flat characters into real people. That was a huge way of how we got people to talk to us, was reminding them of that opportunity. But we knew for us and for the public to really understand what the story was all about, we had to make them relatable.
Right. So when we decided to write a book and we got a contract to write the book, I was initially really worried because I thought the way that, were we ever going to be able to present them as more than just sort of really obnoxious people? And would somebody want to read an entire book about just a bunch of annoying, hateful, entitled people? And so we decided we were really going to split up the names and try to talk with all the defendants. But we had a problem, which was people like you. So not only did they have people like you, but they had multiple of them. They had like the guy who put Whitey Bulger away. They had the Enron prosecutor. They had them all. Then they had crisis communication teams around them. So you could never get to people. You call the lawyers and they'd say, oh, you know what, I might have him sit down with you down the road, but we couldn't trust that. And also because we're writing for the Wall Street Journal, we have a very strict rule there called no surprises, which means that everyone who has anything about them in the paper is entitled to know what is being said about them and have a chance to respond. And so you have to go to very great lengths to reach people. So we would talk to lawyers. I mean, I had a couple on my train into Boston that I would try to pinhole, and they'd be like, no, just, So we needed to contact everyone, and that involved actually trying to either call them, which we couldn't get through, or text them. So we often had to go to houses. We had to go to their towns and try to get letters to them. And normally as a journalist, you go to a community and you walk down the street and you might knock on a door and talk to a neighbor, like, hey, what do you think of Mr. Smith down there? Well, I don't know if you've walked around like Bel Air or Beverly Hills. You can't knock on someone's door. It's gates, and there's no one on the street. There's no one walking up and down the street, except for the landscaping crews. Yeah. So I'd be out there, trying to slip letters in, and Melissa, there's no numbers on the houses, so I'd be on the phone with her and Google Maps, trying to get letters in, and we'd mail stuff, but slowly but surely, we just started to make our case. Really, we were just totally honest. We're writing a book about you. You're in the book. It's not an option not to be. We want to know your side. We want to hear what you have to say. And we started to wear people down, basically. And we ended up talking with a lot of people. I think we spoke with 150 people for the book.
Including some whose lawyers didn't know that they were talking to us.
Yeah. We got some nasty calls after that.
I mean, we would use every means possible. Jennifer mentioned we, traveled. We both went to California multiple times. Calls, text messages, emails, Facebook messages, contacting a relative, contacting an employer or an employee, everything to try to make sure that they knew.
Yeah.
So as Jennifer said, there were some great lengths to which we went and some people that we really wanted to nail down. And one character who kind of haunted us at the beginning was referenced in the affidavit as Yale applicant 1. Not a ton of information there. What we knew from that and a few other charging documents were that she went to Yale, she came from Southern California or had some connection there, and had some ties to China, and that she was pitched as a soccer player. But as we learned quite quickly, that didn't mean she was a soccer player. That was it. There are a lot of young women from Southern California who go to Yale every year. So how the heck do you find that person? Mind you, this is a person whose family paid $1.2 million to Rick Singer to get their kid into Yale. So we started by looking in the school directory. There is a freshman Facebook that a former intern mentioned to me that is kind of a static document that everyone gets when they first move onto campus. And we got access to one of those from what we were pretty sure was the school year she would have been in. And then started looking at the online directory, just searching name by name, did anyone disappear? And weeks went by, and every couple days I would go through the whole list again, because we figured at some point a name is going to disappear when that person is, when it kind of goes through the system that they've been kicked out of school. So again, weeks and weeks and weeks, until one night I am preparing to watch Game of Thrones, had a little bit of time on my hands, ran through the list, and there was a name missing, there was a blank. And I did a little bit of a happy dance and called Jennifer and called our editor at the paper and said, we've got her. That was like the easy part. We then had to do the no surprises and try to contact her. The lengths to which we went were amusing, at least to us, I think. We tried to figure out, okay, who owns her house, right? Chances are her parents own her house if it's owned by their family, or who's renting it. And we have databases that we can find information about people's addresses, emails, phone numbers pretty quickly. I know that's really creepy. But so we knew her address. We knew she was in Irvine, California. We knew that the house she owned was owned by, the house she lived in was owned by a company. We looked at the documents for that company. We called the accountant who signed off on those business papers. We called the lawyer who signed off on those business papers. Couldn't get anything. We had a colleague who spoke Mandarin leave voicemails because we weren't sure. The accountant was bilingual, so we wanted to make sure the message was getting through. We waited a couple of days, which was really nerve-wracking because we didn't know if someone else was going to break the story. But we needed to give them appropriate time. Then we decided, all right, we're not finding this through paperwork. We're not finding it through phones. She's not responding to Facebook messages, certainly. Her Yale email address is gone. So we sent a reporter, one of our LA-based reporters, out to Irvine. I wrote up a letter, emailed it to her. She printed it out on Wall Street Journal letterhead, attached business card, attached my contact info, walked up to this door, knocked on it, and this kind of sleepy 20-ish-year-old kid in PJs opens the door a tiny bit and closes it, and then opens it again a tiny bit, takes the letter and closes it again. And about 2 hours later, I got a phone call from her lawyer. And we were able to get comment from the lawyer about this all. We offered the lawyer the chance for the parents to be named rather than the daughter. In most of our stories, we did not name the kids, again, because a lot of them did not know what happened to them, and a lot of them were under 18. And the lawyer and the girl declined. They did not want her parents named, so she was named. We met with our standards and ethics team at the Journal to talk about kind of the complications of that, and decided, because of her age, she was a little bit older, because of the other circumstances, we needed to use her name and not just her parents' name. So we clearly went through quite extensive lengths. So apologies if you ever get calls from reporters and then they call again and again and again. Usually if you don't respond, they're just going to try that much harder.
Yeah, and since your lawyers will tell you about some of the characters on the legal front, there were some really interesting ones, and we wanted to understand where they were coming from too. And in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the case was led by Steve Frank, he was a former Wall Street Journal reporter. He had been known as just completely dogged. He covered finance. He was just unusually calm. And he would do these MSNBC gigs on the side, like a lot of reporters do. And he was kind of known for this one in 1999 where Martha Stewart had just taken her company public, and she had an interview on MSNBC, and it was just like very fluffy. They were talking about she had served croissants and orange juice at the New York Stock Exchange that day, and everything was going to be great. And then Steve Frank just jumped in. He was only in his 20s in his time. He's like, well, as much as I would like to get your jack-o'-lantern sugar cookie recipe, let's talk about your prospectus. And he had gone through it and identified problems and was asking her tough questions. But he said that, you know, he, as a reporter, he loved being a reporter, but all he wanted was like subpoena power. So he decided to go to law school. And then you had Eric Rosen, Assistant U.S. Attorney, who Hank referenced before, and Eric is just a dogged guy, interesting, kind of like walks around a little bit like he wears the headset, and then his hair is sort of like messed up, and he doesn't kind of always care about like wearing the sharpest suits, and he would ride his bike to work and come in. He'd fall in the winter, and he'd come in with like icicles on him and scrapes, and I think during the time of the case, he was running to work, and he always just looked like he had maybe slept like 3 hours the night before. 3 little kids, so he was the other one on the case. And then Andrew Lelling, the U.S. attorney, he is this really loud voice, and people always think he's yelling at them, but he's just talking. He kind of acts like he's had like 10 cups of coffee all the time, but he had done a lot of big drug ring cases. So he knew about like systems and how to prosecute people, and his strategy was usually to start, you know, sort of toward the bottom and then work up to the kingpin. And this case was unusual because they had the guy at the top first. Rick Singer was cooperating with him early. They had caught him, and then they were getting all the parents through like sting operations. So he was very skeptical of that process and nervous about Rick Singer and having him and keeping him in line. And sure enough, they ran into problems very quickly.
Right, they had a lot of reason to doubt Singer's commitment to being a cooperator, and, you know, given that he was charged with fraud, could they trust him? Singer was a master manipulator. We spoke to so many of his former clients, both legal and otherwise, because he did have a full, legit college counseling business on the side. Or maybe that was the main one and this was the side. But he was quite a character. He incredibly smart, very street smart, very competitive, frenetic energy. You know, there was some charisma to that, and you can see if he's telling a parent, "Don't worry, we got this." You say, "Okay, great. You know, let's make this happen." So he was just smooth as can be. He did obstruct justice. After signing his cooperation agreement in late September of 2018, he proceeded to tell a number of families, "Hey, if I call, just say, like, I don't remember," and hang up. Or he went to their houses and told them, you know, "Hey, there's something going on, like, let's stop this deal now." Turns out the feds say that there were 6 cases that they couldn't bring because of his obstruction. So they added another charge to him. And, you know, that was not ideal. So they brought him back to Boston and kind of locked him down and said, "You're going to sit here, and one of us is going to sit here with you every phone call you make." And he made scores of phone calls to dozens of parents, and under the auspices of an audit for his charity. "Hey, remember the time you sent me that check for $200,000, you know, to get your kid into school, and the photoshopping and all that? Do you remember that?" "Uh-huh. Yeah, of course." "Great, thanks." You know, hang up the phone. Well, not really, but, you know, he was just powering through these. And he would sit in the U.S. Attorney's office in his little tracksuit, because he hated suits, never dressed up. So he would sit there in his tracksuit just making these calls, and the attorneys would follow him to the bathroom because, again, they just did not trust him. He had a burner phone. So he decided, once he committed, he fully committed, though. And he was kind of, all right, what else can I do? How else can I help? You know, being the competitive guy that he was. So he ended up being both a great hindrance to the investigation and ultimately a very good help to the investigation.
And as the case unfolded, what was really interesting that was the different strategies that the defendants were taking, how they were reacting. And I think one of the starkest differences was that the two most high-profile people, Lori Loughlin, who people know as Aunt Becky from Full House, and Felicity Huffman, Desperate Housewives. So Felicity Huffman, when she came in for her initial appearance, she looked just very, no makeup, just very dressed down. She looked sad. People were sympathetic.
She kind of looked like she was going to a funeral.
She did. She looked like she was going to a funeral. So she came in, and you saw kind of the public saying, gosh, it's not fair. What about her husband? He was probably in on it too. And why is she taking the fall? And there was, she looked, I don't know if it was how she felt, how her lawyer advised her. But Lori Loughlin took a different approach. So in her initial appearance, she came to Boston, and she got out of a limo in the front of the courthouse with tinted windows, and she looked like a movie star, and she waved to the crowd. There were people outside, and she started to just smile. She had a big smile on her face. She went into the courthouse, and she walked through, and then walked upstairs and greeted people along the way and shook their hands. Hi, I'm Lori. Hi, I'm Lori. And people were like, okay. And then she went into the courtroom and went over to where the prosecutors were sitting, the prosecution table, and went down the row and introduced herself and shook everyone's hand. And I just remember one of the lawyers for another parent was sitting near me, and he just goes, oh, this is effing embarrassing. People just couldn't believe it. So there was like different strategies that were playing out in the court. And there was this big group of parents who pleaded guilty right at the same time, very quick after the case, like I think in April. So then that fall, there were a bunch of sentencing. And one after another, it was like almost one a week. And all the lawyers who had clients would go to all of them because they wanted to see like what was working, what wasn't. It was this one judge. And you could really quickly see some real fails in there. And one of them was, the government was wanted to really emphasize how wealthy everyone was. So that was a big part of their argument. Like they would put in a lot of details. She was by her infinity pool, and they would have, information about how much someone's home had cost. And the defendants were really trying to make themselves look real down to earth and sort of, authentic and so forth. So they would have a lot of their letters. They'd have their friends and everybody write letters on their behalf. And some of them were just like hurt the people more than they helped because there was this one, her friends were, let's see it, well, they would have a lot of people like on their payroll. There was, the French interior decorator who wrote, I had the privilege of doing Marcia and Greg's home in Manhattan and Aspen. They are wonderful people. There was the note from the two maids about just how nice they were about allowing them off, on holidays and good times. There was another woman, her instructor who gave private lessons, taught her daughter the pirouette at their house, wrote a nice note. There were notes from the doorman. And then there was another one where a lot of people had written in saying, look, he just did what any parent would do, and he just loved his kids, and he just did what anyone would do. And so the judge in that case, Judge Indira Tawani, she said, to him in sentencing, like that had hurt him because she said that I believe you are remorseful, but I see your group, and I need to sentence as a deterrent as well, and I need to deter people from doing this. And your friends and your group, they have not gotten the message that they're writing in that they're just doing this, you didn't do this just because you loved your kid. You did this for this reason and that reason and status. And so that was really interesting to see how some of these things could kind of end up backfiring on people.
And you didn't mention the Cessna.
Oh, there was a letter that I just couldn't believe it. It said that Marcia, you know, she didn't mind getting her hands dirty. I saw her dusting her Cessna. Like, you couldn't make it up. I was thinking, I told Melissa, I was like, we got to start some kind of consulting firm after journalism. The people, we could get a job like writing these letters. Like, I'll write you a good letter. This is not it.
So this whole situation, right, paying lots of money to get your kid into college is kind of icky. There's something gross about it. But is it illegal? And that was a really tough point for the prosecutors to make. And they didn't always know the best way to make it. The defense attorneys at the same time didn't always know the best way to defend against it. But there were so many questions about this. What did they actually steal? Was it a spot at a school? How do you value that spot? Was the school a victim? I mean, they got tuition money in the end, so they didn't have any loss. You know, the school got the money from the athletics program sometimes too. So when these sentencing started, the U.S. Probation Office determined that there was no loss. So these were all first-time white-collar criminals. They weren't getting, you know, 20 years in prison anyway. But this dropped down their recommended sentences to, you know, 0 to 6 months. So there was this great fear from lawyers that, great fear from prosecutors that a lot of these people could walk. And what justice does that do? So there was this flurry of court activity and motions and a hearing, and sentencings were delayed, and it was very exciting. And we happened to be having breakfast with one of the defense attorneys when the judge issued her ruling saying, essentially, this is going to be case by case. So don't get too worked up about each one. And you know, if it was just paying money to get your kid into college, that's one thing. That's what Rick Singer called the back door, making large donations above board and giving a little wink nudge to the admissions director when your kid comes up. The real crux of this was that there was fraud, right? There were people who said that their kid was taking test X and they were taking, you know, not taking the test or taking the test with help. They were submitting scores that were not honest scores. And then even more blatant, they were pitching these kids as people that they were not, either through their resumes, their, you know, athletic accolades, or actual pictures of them. And that's ultimately what kind of made the case for the prosecutors, because a lot of the defense attorneys, their main defense was it was just a donation. It's what everyone does, just maybe a little bit more extreme, sure. But this was just a donation to the sailing club or to, you know, the tennis team. What, don't blame us, you know, the school kind of made us do it.
So we spent a lot of time in the courthouse, but for the book, we really wanted to do it like a narrative crime drama. So we had to get other scenes, and of course, we weren't there at these places, so you have to go back and try to recreate it. And there were just real challenges in that. But a big thing we wanted to talk about was that morning when they had gone out to the homes, and like 13 homes in LA alone. And so I was talking with one of the parents. I had just gotten a pretty good rapport. He'd wanted to know, like he had not been sentenced yet, so he was always wanting to know, like, what did the judge say to him? How did this guy act in court? So I would just text with him now and then and say, you know, not tell him anything we weren't printing, but just kind of give him the lay of the land. And he said one day, he's like, I know that guy that got sentenced today. He was in the same cell as me that morning. And I said, what do you mean in the same cell? He goes, oh yeah, there was a bunch of us in the same cell there in LA. And I just thought, that's a really interesting scene. So I got him on the phone, and what he said was that, you know, they'd all been arrested at their homes, taken into custody in the way that the FBI does it, where like a whole bunch of people come to your house, like 10 people and guns, and I mean, it's a big, huge deal, and they're, you know, banging on the doors, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, people were in their pajamas. I think they were allowed to change. I remember one woman was like in her Pilates clothes. And, they take them down to the courthouse, the federal lockup in downtown LA, and they take them into, they put the men in one cell and the women in another. And then something really interesting started to happen. They started to recognize one another. And they couldn't quite figure out what they all had in common. Because for some of these people, it had been several years since this happened with Rick Singer. And they didn't know who else was working with Rick Singer, because you didn't really go around telling people that you did this. So this particular parent said that in his cell, there were several of the parents, and there was like a dentist in his dentist wear, and there were coaches, and they're just looking like, what do we all have in common? Like, what is this? And then finally someone just said, do you guys know Rick Singer? And they all just went, oh my God. And realized,
There were some kind of moments of levity that, obviously that was not fun for them. It was fun for all of us. But one of my favorite things was how USC was treated in court. So in one instance, one daughter got into UCLA through the scheme, another got into USC through the scheme. The judge says, of course, I know UCLA, of course, but USC, what is that? Is that a public school? Is that a private school? What's USC? And there was a little offense taken to that. It was very embarrassing for USC. People were asking both, kind of in the galley at the court or in newsrooms that shall not be named, why would someone pay to get their kid into USC? Turns out it's a lot harder to get into now than it was when they were going to college. But it stuck, right? That USC was just kind of this other school that's somehow being said in the same breath as Stanford and Yale all of a sudden. And one newspaper, not ours, referenced elite schools and USC. So, the judges sometimes were intentionally funny, sometimes not so much, and we never could know which direction they were going to go, kind of how hard they'd be on the various families. One of my favorites was Judge Gorton telling former PIMCO CEO Doug Hodge, who did the scheme for 5 children, said, there's no word in English to describe what you've done, but you have a lot of chutzpah. There was one instance in which the judge pretty much told the father who got probation, you didn't try to hide this. You paid cash, you took out certain amounts of money from the ATM so that you thought you wouldn't be noticed. You weren't trying to pretend this wasn't a crime. You acted like a criminal, and I kind of appreciate that. So he got probation. The others tried to have a tax write-off on their donations. So she appreciated the candor there.
One of the voices we really wanted to get was a student. So there was, that was difficult. A lot of them were under 18. So we reached out to all the ones who were adults when any of them talked to us, and we tried for months, and we weren't getting anywhere with that. And finally, in late 2019, one of a young man that I had reached out to got back to me on Facebook Messenger, and he just said, I want to talk. And he was, we've published his name, so I can say his name. His name is Mateo Sloan, and he was the one whose father put him in the pool and pretended he was a water polo player. And he got into USC that way. So we had a long conversation, and he just described, he was at this very competitive private school in LA. They started him in 9th grade on, as he called it, on like the essay train. They were already working toward college, and he was just working really hard. You had to get extracurriculars, and he said it was that he felt like, he and his friends felt like they were under a lot of pressure, and that their parents just were way too invested in their achievements, and he described it to me as like just being kind of gross, how much they're into what we do, and that his father, like they had guidance counselors at school. They had like one for every 10 kids or something, and his father started bringing around Rick Singer, and they really started pushing USC on him, and we had a long, we talked, and he said the pool thing was his father had told him, had made up some story. So his father did a lot in production and with movies, and I want you to pose in the pool with this, and he didn't know what it was, and we did confirm he had not sent the application. He was not the one that pushed the button, and he said that he'd been home that day when his father, home from school on spring break, when his father was taken into custody, and his dad had been in lockup all day, and he said his father had come home that night, and he was in the kitchen, Mateo, and he said he just looked at his father and just said, "Why didn't you believe in me?" So it was really, he was so well-spoken and thoughtful, and the thing was he had a list of schools that were just sort of regular schools. Like, he knew his own, he didn't care about a big name. He wanted to go to maybe UC Santa Cruz. He was into the environment. So he just felt like, like his life at that moment, like his life had been ruined. And his father had already gone to prison, and he was starting to forgive him and going to visit him. But the next day I had to call to get response to some of the things Mateo had said about his parents. So I called his father's lawyer, and there was just this silence on the phone when he realized I had interviewed Mateo, and just...
Mateo never told his dad or his dad's lawyer that he was going to talk to us.
But then the father was, when he heard about it, he was really upset, and he told Mateo, "You should have never done this. You've really now really put yourself out there, and this is going to be a big problem for you, and poor judgment." And then the article came out, and he looked like really thoughtful. People understood what had happened, and his father was like, "Wow, I was wrong. You can handle yourself." So ironically, like, Mateo was almost his way of showing his father, like, I can do things myself.
So there were these drips and drabs of guilty pleas and sentencings, and there were 2 trials. Pretty much everyone pleaded guilty. One person was pardoned by Donald Trump. Actually, a Florida guy. Sam Grillo is a real estate developer. But there were 2 trials. 2 parents went to trial, and 1 coach went to trial in 2021, and they were all convicted. So this was considered, a pretty big win for the feds. This whole time, Rick Singer is out and about. And I get text messages about sightings. I'm in a restaurant in DC. I think I see Rick. Do you know if he's in DC? Or, I just saw him surfing in Orange County. He sold his house. He moved to Florida. So many Florida pictures. He started a walking club in his community in Florida. He was always staying active. And of course, he was the main cooperator, so they had to wait to see just how substantial his assistance had been. So they went through all the other cases, and then finally, they go to sentence him. And then it gets pushed back. And then there's a conflict. And then it gets pushed back again. And then his attorney passed away. So the attorney needed to get caught up on the case. So years later, Singer was sentenced earlier this month, and I was in the courtroom, and there's that terrifying moment, but also excitement, at least as a bystander. He was given 42 months in prison and had to give up nearly $20 million in ill-gotten gains. And then somehow everything came full circle. I was upstairs in the press room, and they were kind of having this sort of conclusion press conference about, why this case was so important and how they had done it and what it meant for Singer to be a cooperator here. And And I'm not super optimistic. I was at a conference for admissions officers and college counselors a couple of years ago, shortly after this case had broken, and their main line was, "This is not an admissions scandal." There were no admissions officers who were charged. This wasn't an admissions scandal. This was a sports scandal. This was a testing scandal. Don't blame us. The pandemic actually changed a few things. If only these families had waited a little while, they wouldn't have had to take the SAT. It would have been so much easier. But no, admissions isn't fixed. It's not magically a clean, fair, merit-based system, and it never was, and it likely never will be. And had a few conversations here tonight to that And, you know, there's this case happening in front of the Supreme Court. You may have heard about it, about affirmative action, kind of a big deal in this world. You know, our story, our coverage highlighted a different kind of affirmative action. The boosts that go to those who already have every privilege, the legacies, the athletes, the wealthy. And I don't want to sound like a downer, but that's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say one kind of interesting thing was just yesterday I talked with one of the parents in this, checking in, like just curious how life was going, and it was like an entirely different person. He was one of the most sort of in denial. He pled guilty, but every time I would speak with him, he would just talk about how he was conned into this. He didn't really do it. He did it, but he didn't know what he was getting into, and he felt it was unfair. And I just heard something completely different. It's like time had marched on, and he had accepted it. And he said that, you know, I'm thinking of speaking out about it, talking to people about what I did. And my wife said, well, do you really want to be that person that's out there just keeping this alive? And he said, well, it's already, like, all you have to do is Google me. It's all out there. So he's thinking of, like, taking control and, like, doing podcasts maybe, and but there was no, and he said, and interviewing people like me who had it all and just crossed the line anyway about why they crossed the line. I couldn't believe it. It was a completely different person, and it was sort of an uplifting thing to see.
Plus, once the pandemic hit, nobody cared about the story anyway.
Yeah.
I know we've spoken for a while. If anybody has questions, we're happy to answer them either right now or off to the side. If Hank pulls out the little cane thing. I see one hand. Hank, do we have time for a couple questions? Yeah? Okay. Exactly. Just
as we discussed before, and you know I care about this because I went to UCLA and I hate USC. But what percentage of the children knew they were involved in this scandal and participated?
I think it's honestly hard to have a kind of black and white there. There were some kids, a handful of kids, who really were involved, right? Like they were in on it. They knew how they were getting into these schools. There were some who kind of knew there was something a little bit fishy. Like, you know, I know my grades. I know what the admin rate at that school is. Like, Dad, is something weird going on? And then there were, the majority did not know that their parents were using these wild machinations to get them into school. They were either oblivious because they were kept out of it, or kind of just didn't connect the dots in a way that maybe they could have. But most of them really were not. They may have known something was up, but they weren't running it. They weren't in the driver's seat. And the judges actually said, you know, none of the kids were charged in this. It was the parents. The parents were the ones doing it. And the kids were either along for the ride, either willingly or not.
The parents who did bring the kids into meetings and phone calls and had them really active got tougher sentences too.
We'll be around a little bit later if anyone, oh, did you have one? Okay. We'll be around a little bit later if anyone has other questions as well.
Thank you both, and just for those of you who aren't aware of it, it was an education about the Wall Street Journal. They have a policy that under no circumstances can anybody pay for their expenses to come here, their meals, or anything else. That's considered an inappropriate compensation for their employees. So the agreement was reached, and I want to thank the publisher who said the publisher will step up, because that was permissible for the Wall Street Journal, but that's the only way they could have come here tonight. So thank you. They both agreed to be out there, outside the door. If anyone else has any books they would like signed or questions or whatever. I thank you, everyone. Mr. Chief Justice, thank you. Well, good evening.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sharing that committee. Well, you're right. It's more than a committee. Hey! Oh my God!
We don't see people often.
How are you? You're good? Promise? Oh my God, I'm so excited to see everybody! You know, I just went, you're so sweet. I decided January